Fulton Depot, Underground, Subway Station, New York. Petty Officer Jack Caldwell, a U.S. Army Special Forces soldier, leaned heavily against a concrete wall, feeling the cold soak through his flak jacket to his heated body. Fatigue weighed down like a weight weighing hundreds of pounds. His muscles are clogged, and his fingers ache from the constant strain, but he holds the weapon tightly. The saw machine gun is his continuation, his only salvation. It was dark in the subway, and the air was thick, stale, and heavy. It smelled of burning, sweat, dampness, and something else sweet, musty, like the smell of a dead rat in a vent. Far down the tunnel, beyond the wrecked carriages, the wind rustled and howled. Caldwell slowly glanced at his companions. 4 fighters, just as exhausted but collected, tense. Lieutenant Graves was sitting by a concrete pillar, his head thrown back, trying to catch his breath. His armor was covered in soot, and his face was stained with soot. Somewhere nearby, Jacobs was checking ammunition, cursing in a low voice. The others, Martinez and Henley, remained alert, pointing their guns into the darkness. They were alive. While. But I couldn't close my eyes. Damn it, you can't! Caldwell tilted his head back. Eyelids are heavier than lead. He shook his head, but his mind was inexorably sinking into a pool of memories. Sand, the heat of the Middle East, the whirring of the Black Hawk's rotors, kicking up dust and gravel. The team is moving forward in full combat gear, checking every piece of the fucking desert. The last war. They are young, confident, laughing at silly jokes about girls from the technical committee and support at the airbase. Back then, they believed that there was nothing to be afraid of. Then the enemy was understandable, palpable. The world was different then. A sharp leap in memory. New York. His New York. Taxi horn honks. Coffee in a paper cup. He stands at the kiosk while his wife chooses something. A light breeze brings to him the scent of her perfume. Sweet vanilla, with hints of cinnamon. His daughter pulls his sleeve. "Daddy, look!" and points to a kite soaring in the blue sky. Damn, it's too dangerous to get lost in memories, especially here, especially now. Jack Caldwell was afraid of this moment, the moment when consciousness would pull him back to the past, to that damned day when the world collapsed. It all started with flashes in the sky, bright, distant, but blinding. There were many of them, dozens, hundreds, a whole swarm of sparks scattering in the sky, as if someone had broken a glass sphere and its fragments froze in the sky. No one knew what it was. For a week, the television chattered about anomalies. Scientists claimed that this cluster of comets was somewhere near Venus, rare but absolutely natural. Someone talked about the unusual glow of the atmosphere, invented pseudo-scientific hypotheses about solar diffuse prominences. The politicians reassured, "There is no threat. Everything is under control." That's a lie. The military knew. They knew, but they didn't say anything. Caldwell understood that now. He understood how the behavior of the command had changed dramatically by the sudden exercises, by the urgent recall of reservists, by the damned closed briefings that were held at their base and where he was not allowed. And then all hell broke loose. The first wave hit the largest cities in the world. New York, Washington, Los Angeles, London, Paris, Moscow, Beijing. No one escaped the blow. Caldwell remembered turning on the news and seeing the burning ruins of Chicago. I remembered how the announcer would break into a scream before the signal disappeared, leaving only a dull, white noise. It was impossible to delay. It was necessary to act. He told his wife to grab her daughter and basic necessities and immediately drive to Tallahassee, avoiding bus stops and federal highways as much as possible. He remembered how his wife clung to his hand, her fingers trembling. There were no tears in her eyes, just fear, panic-stricken, sticky, and numbing. "Jack, don't go. Please." I have to go." "No." She grabbed him by the collar with a force he hadn't expected. "Something's wrong." "They don't say anything. Jack, I'm begging you. I'm scared." "I have to be with the military. We will fight them back." She fell silent. "I was just watching." He remembered her face at that moment, pale, confused, so fragile. He knew he should have said something else. Promise to come back, say that everything will be fine. But he didn't do it. He released her fingers and walked away. That was the last time he saw her. Now he has convinced himself, broken his psyche, and believed that his wife and daughter are in Tallahassee, safe, although he knew that they were most likely long dead. Caldwell dreamed of a train. He was rushing through the tunnel at a terrific speed, roaring, shaking, vibrating, turning the air into a rumbling storm. Flashes of light darted across its body, distorting its outlines, turning it into something alive, into a monster rushing through the darkness. And they were standing on the tracks, wife and daughter. "Dad, save us!" the girl screamed, holding out her arms to him, but he couldn't move. His feet were rooted to the concrete, and his breath stopped in his throat. The train was rushing, roaring, sparks flying in all directions. "No!" Caldwell shouted, rushing forward, but it was too late. A crash and a flash of light. He woke up with a sharp intake of breath, jerking forward, his fingers convulsively clutching the handle of the machine gun. My heart was pounding in my chest, my ears were ringing, and my breathing was racing, jumping from wheezing to short breaths. Where is he? Metro. New York. The subway. His eyes darted wildly around the room. Dim lights, concrete columns, dead wires hanging from the ceiling. He's still here, still here. "Shit!" he whispered, clutching his face with his hands. "Dream. It's just a dream."
"Wake up! The intelligence is coming back!"
The whisper cut through the silence like a blade. Caldwell started, jerked his head up, and met Graves' gaze. The lieutenant looked the same as all of them, exhausted, stained with soot, but there was a hard concentration in his eyes. This kept them all from falling into the abyss of despair. There were cautious footsteps at the far end of the tunnel. The three fighters, silhouetted in the dim light of the lanterns, were rapidly approaching. Russians. They arrived in the United States just a few days before the disaster. An internship. Joint exercises. It didn't matter now. The border between the nations disappeared in the fire of the invasion. They were no longer Americans or Russians. Now they were just people fighting for the remnants of their world. Caldwell exhaled heavily, wiping the sweat from his forehead with his palm, and tightened his grip on the machine gun. He didn't know what news the intelligence had brought, but they were almost certainly bad. Nations, languages, status, ideologies, all died in the first weeks of the invasion. Now all those who survived were just two-legged brutes, doomed to extermination. Most of humanity died in the first strikes. Cities burst into flames, collapsed, and turned into stone crypts strewn with charred bodies. The remaining people were hiding. The New York subway, dark, damp, and infested with rats, became their last refuge. Those who were more fortunate dug deeper, into mountain shelters, into old military bunkers. It was possible to contact them, but rarely, at risk. The surface of the planet no longer belonged to humans. They ruled on the surface. Exterminators. Jack saw them. Tall, unnaturally thin but powerful, clad in smooth ceramic armor. Their limbs seemed out of proportion, and their fingers were long, broken, and tipped with claws designed to kill. Elongated skulls, devoid of eyes, but with narrow slits on the sides, in which dim gray light flickered. The light of reason, but not the mind of man. They didn't scream, they didn't growl, they didn't hiss. They moved in silence, with only a slight creak of armor, and the squelching sounds of wet, thin breathing bags on their necks, which contracted and swelled like gills. Their technology was not human. They didn't use their usual weapons. Instead, they poisoned people like rats, gassing them into dead ends, into traps where the victims suffocated, writhing in convulsions, and then they were simply finished off. They were not captured, studied, or captured. People were of no value to exterminators. Jack saw them. I saw them methodically slaughtering hundreds of people without showing a drop of emotion. They didn't hate. They didn't need torment or screams. They were just doing their job. And that job consisted of one thing: to exterminate humanity. 3 scouts, smeared in mud and soot, stood silently at the entrance to the tunnel from which they had just returned. Nikolai Smirnov, the senior of the group, leaned heavily on his FN Scar H, a reliable, time-tested rifle. It was more than welcome in the dungeon, as its powerful caliber could even penetrate the armor of creatures. Wearily, he held out his hand, silently asking for a flask. Sergeant Jacobs narrowed his eyes, but without a word he tossed Nikolai a plastic bottle of water. Smirnov accepted it, unscrewed the lid, and squeezed his eyes shut greedily as the steaming water trickled down his parched throat. "It's clear 2 stations away," he finally exhaled, running his hand over his unshaven face. "But you can't go to the branch." "There." Graves looked up instantly, catching his eye. "What's in there?" Behind Smirnov, 2 of his men, Valery Tsiganov and Maxim Tarasov, exchanged glances. Tsiganov clenched his jaw, but said nothing. Tarasov, who did not know English, simply wiped his sweaty forehead with his sleeve and lowered his gaze. "The creatures were storing corpses there." "Silence." Jack, who was sitting against the wall and checking his C4 backpack, froze, not taking his eyes off the explosives. His fingers rested on the plastic body of the detonator. "Hundreds." Smirnov's voice was hoarse and dry. He pretended that it was just information, just facts. But his eyes said something else. "Maybe thousands. You can't breathe in the tunnel. They decompose, and the creatures... they..." He stammered, gritting his teeth. "They're rummaging through them." Graves exhaled slowly through his nose. Jacobs swore angrily and scratched his hand across his face. Martinez looked away as if hoping it was just a bad dream.
What do you mean, they're rummaging?
Graves asked, looking straight into Smirnov's face. The Russian looked at him expectantly. Then he said calmly, "They eat them. We've seen this before." Jack clenched his jaw so hard that his teeth hurt. Smirnov looked towards the dark tunnel leading into the depths of the subway, as if he saw this sight in front of him again. "We can't get through there without sinking knee, deep into the gut. It's just straight for us." He took another sip of water, as if he could wash the taste of those words out of his mouth. Jack understood what Nikolai was talking about. North Manhattan, Harlem, has been turned into a paddock, huge, surrounded by a metal grid. There are hundreds of people inside, remnants of the survivors, women, children, the elderly, ordinary townspeople who are unlucky. Exterminators guarded the perimeter, their motionless, shapeless heads like smooth black stone, slowly turned, fixing the movement. They stood in perfectly even rows, their ceramic armor gleaming like the expanded shell of predatory insects. In their hands they held long, jagged poles, which, when touched to living flesh, gave off a powerful discharge of energy. They used them to drive people like cattle. But exterminators were not executioners. They were just watching. The Punishers came later. They didn't look like exterminators. They moved in a different way. Their silhouettes were monstrously tall and thin, covered with red growths. Their limbs ended in flexible, whip-like appendages that writhed and wiggled on their own, like the tentacles of a dying octopus. They entered the pen one at a time, methodically. No rush. They chose a victim. They pulled her out of the crowd like a doll and tore her apart. At such moments, the exterminators began to howl and make gurgling sounds with their breathing bags. They were jubilant. Jack saw it. I've seen how a person can be torn in half, how organs and bones fall out, how the body still twitches for a few seconds after death. They tore and ate. Not all at once, in pieces, in front of people huddled together and distraught with horror. On that sortie, Jack's squad lost its first fighter, Juan Ibanez, a veteran who went through the meat grinder of the Balkan and Iraq wars. He has endured a lot. But not that. They crouched in the basement of a destroyed grocery store, pressed to the floor. The air was stinky, saturated with smoke and decay. They were watching through the broken bars. They saw everything, but they couldn't do anything. Ibanez was trembling. "I can't. Don't do this, Juan." Jack Caldwell's voice was steady. He knew what was going to happen. "I can't." Ibanez pulled out a grenade, pulled out the pin. "They're killing kids, Jack!" "Ibanez, damn it, stop!" But he was already crawling forward, and Jack couldn't grab him. The explosion blew apart some of the creatures guarding the pen, but he didn't save anyone. In a blind rage, the creatures rushed at the humans. They didn't figure out where the attack was coming from. They killed everyone. 100 people, women, children, old people, men. Everyone was torn to pieces. Jack lay in the dark and listened to the last screams turn into a wheeze, and he couldn't do anything. The group moved along the rails, trying not to raise dust or touch anything that could cause noise. The silence was oppressive, broken only by drops of water falling from the rotten utilities overhead. Graves was walking next to Nikolai, and his gaze slid to a side branch, a narrow tunnel leading deep into the subway. "What about the guards there?" "What is it?" he asked softly. Smirnov did not immediately respond. He didn't like talking on the move, especially in the dark. Any sound could cost a life. "2 exterminators. You can remove it, but—" He shook his head. "If they notice, they will raise the others?" Everyone knew how it would turn out. During the months in the underground, the fighters learned to hide. They realized that the creatures were guided more by smell than by vision. That's why their armored suits were covered in soot. It clogged the human smell. The creatures smelled the smell more strongly than they heard the sound. Graves nodded. "Everything is quiet. The main thing is not to run into people. People... They hid in the subway, in branches, in technical tunnels, in old station rooms. Someone was afraid, hiding, trying not to make any noise, not to move, waiting for the nightmare to end. Someone was killing for food. Hunger turned people into animals with knives and broken rebar. They walked through the tunnels in search of prey, not caring who was in front of them. Cannibalism was rampant. Someone was looking for the legendary warehouses, supplies supposedly left behind in case of a nuclear war. It was said that somewhere in the subway there are abandoned bunkers, tons of provisions, weapons, medicines. But more often, those who went in search disappeared. Some died at the hands of exterminators. Others fell into the clutches of people who had long ceased to be human. Nikolai strode forward, holding the FN Scar H at the ready. The stench of the subway made its way through the removable respirator with clogged filters, but he no longer felt it. He was dulled, accustomed, resigned. Every step echoed hollowly in the tunnel, disappearing into the darkness, which now seemed endless to him. He didn't know why they were still fighting. The world is dead. There are only a handful of people left who are able to hold weapons and organize resistance. They thought their slaughter meant something, but deep down he knew the truth. It was like stabbing a parallon wall with a needle, hoping to break through it. Their attacks made no sense. The exterminators were stronger, faster, smarter. They didn't know fatigue, fear, or doubt. They moved unmistakably, without emotion, without any signs of individuality. Cars? No. They weren't cars. They were worse. They were immaculately precise, predatory, and alive, and that was why there was no hope. But they continued to fight anyway. Why? For whom? For what? Nikolai caught himself thinking that he didn't know the answer himself. Maybe he was just moving forward because stopping meant dying? Or was it because he couldn't give himself up without a fight, because dying for nothing was worse than dying in battle? He wondered again if it was all worth anything. 3 days ago, he had already asked himself this question, and to some extent I found the answer to it. They came across a looter. It happened in one of the side tunnels at 14th Street, Union Square. A narrow passage, the concrete walls were covered with mold, the smell of rot and rotten water was in the air. There was a man sitting in the dark. He was thin, dirty, and wore a torn jacket, but a bright orange vest shone over it. A former subway worker? An electrician? A repairman? It didn't matter now. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor, eating stew. He couldn't open the rusty jar. He was picking at it with a bar of rebar, thrusting the bent metal inside, catching pieces of meat and pulling them into his mouth. He ate greedily, quickly, licking his fingers, putting his dirty hands inside so as not to lose a single piece. There were 2 corpses lying next to him, a girl and a woman. Nikolai immediately understood what had happened. You didn't have to be an investigator or a criminologist to see that the woman's clothes were torn, her legs were unnaturally spread, her face was smashed, and there was dried blood on her lips. The girl was very small, no more than 8 years old. Her neck was twisted, and Nikolai did not know who had been killed earlier, the girl or her mother. Why did he decide for himself that they were mother and daughter? The man raised his head and saw armed men approaching, but he did not jump up, did not throw the jar, did not grab a weapon. He just froze, with his mouth slightly open, in which a piece of canned meat was sticking out. The Americans captured him. Graves pressed him against the wall, gritting his teeth. "We will interrogate him. He might have seen something important." But the Russians didn't even hesitate. They understood everything without words, silent agreement in the eyes. Nikolai stepped forward, grabbed the bastard by the scruff of the neck and dragged him to the tracks. The man was screaming. He prayed. He muttered something about how he's scared too, that he just wanted to survive, that he didn't touch anyone. No one was listening. They turned him around to face the tunnel, and they shot him. After that, Nikolai was silent for a long time, and now, walking forward through this cursed maze of a dead city, he asked himself this question again. Who are they fighting for? For people like that bastard? No. For those he killed. For normal people. For those who still hope for a miracle. Today, the squad had a very specific task: to plant explosives at the exits of 3 metro stations, conduct reconnaissance, and comb the territory. If possible, evacuate civilians deep into the subway, to a sector that was considered relatively safe. There they had a supply of water, food, and weapons. There were the homes of the first 20 settlers, the people they were able to get off the surface and out of the subway, while it was still possible. In the first days of the attack, when the subway stopped, those who rode the trains survived. The tunnels were dark and damp, but safe. No one understood what was going on. There were no explosions on the surface, communications were lost, and the stations were filled with confused passengers. People hoped that everything would calm down soon. Metro workers tried to keep at least some order. They didn't know yet that cities were already ablaze on the streets, and black monoliths were hovering in the sky, dropping fire on all living things. But then the massacre began. The subway has become a trap. Without water, without food, without information, people went off the rails. Some tried to get out but disappeared. Others locked themselves in the station rooms, hoping to stay out. But the main thing is that people started killing each other. Robberies, random murders, cannibalism. Everyone wanted to be a leader. Everyone was fighting only for their lives. Graves and Nikolai, when they received the order to comb the subway, saw it first. It was here that they gained a foothold, gathered combat-ready people, and organized the defense. They stayed when the command disappeared. The military headquarters at Madison Square Garden stopped communicating. There were no orders, and Graves finally assumed command. The Russian trainees agreed immediately, seeing Graves as a good commander. Martinez was the radio operator in the group. He had a portable radio scanner that he turned on every day at the same time, hoping to catch something, someone. The connection was maintained. There were still a handful of military survivors somewhere in Colorado. They transmitted brief messages, coordinates, marks on maps, and warned of the movement of exterminators. But the strangest thing was that the satellite connection was still working. The aliens could shut it down at any moment. They could turn it off. They could destroy the satellites. But they didn't do it. Why? No one knew the answer to that question. Graves called a halt when they reached the station. There was no lighting. Only the faint glow of lanterns glided along the walls, turning the peeling tiles into pale spots among the dirt and soot. The silence was heavy and tense, but so far there was nothing to indicate the presence of strangers. Graves quickly issued orders to inspect the surrounding areas, set up guards, and check the tunnels. The Russians, along with the Americans, took up positions, becoming a familiar unit in this world where neither countries nor borders existed anymore. They all had common enemies now. "How long before the radio session?" Graves asked Martinez. 15 minutes, the radio operator replied, glancing at the portable scanner mounted on top of his bulletproof vest. "We're waiting," the lieutenant said shortly. Nikolai sat down on a piece of concrete slab, checked the magazine, pulled the bolt mechanically, as usual, then casually glanced at Caldwell. "Jack, do you have a family?" The answer came instantly, short and sharp.
Fuck you!
Nikolai grinned and looked towards the dark tunnel where the dust was swirling. "My whole family is in Moscow, and Moscow is in ruins. Whether they survived or not, no one knows. Maybe they managed to get out to a village near Moscow, but who knows which is worse, to die right away or not." Caldwell didn't say anything, just shifted his position, moving the machine gun closer to the escalator leading up. He didn't want to talk about it. Not with Nikolai. Not with anyone. "Don't pick on him," Valeri said, lighting a cigarette. They still had cigarettes, although there were already the last packs left, found in looted stores. Someone in this hell wanted to smoke even more than they wanted to eat. Smirnov struck a lighter, sat down next to it, inhaled the smoke, held it in his lungs, as if trying to expel the smell of dampness and death that had ingrained into the armor. "I wonder what's in Russia," Tsiganov said thoughtfully, staring into the darkness. "Is there any resistance there? What about the authorities?" Nikolai blew out smoke and thought about it. "Everything is in a fog. There is no connection. There is no information. Maybe the military is still holding out. Maybe they went to the taiga. Hell knows him." Martinez, who was sitting a little further away, suddenly raised his hand, clenched into a fist. Everyone instantly froze. The communication session has started. The scanner crackled like an old radio trying to pick up a signal from another world. Graves snatched out a notebook. The pencil froze in his hand as he checked the time on his wristwatch. No one was moving. Everyone was listening. The voice broke through the noise and wheezing static, fast, distorted, soaked in horror. "Montana! Montana transmits with a wide spectrum. Underground shelters. We're locked in. There is no escape. The battles are fought on the floors." Martinez frowned, picking up the frequency, but didn't interfere. Graves just tightened his grip on the pencil, taking in every word. From the last radio interception session, Russia has launched nuclear strikes on Washington, Chicago, Mexico City, and in the Pacific region. The information is being updated. A chill ran down Nikolai's spine. Valeri took a slow drag, without taking his eyes off the speaker. "A new force. Resistance of the Urals. Republic." Tsiganov grimaced. "The Republic? What kind of nonsense is this?"
The U.S. government evacuated to Wisconsin is destroyed. All Federal Reserve Command posts are lost. Code 000.
Caldwell, who had been motionless all this time, tensed up. Code 000 meant the complete collapse of the government and the army. But the voice in the speaker continued.
2 Army Corps.
Pause. The rustling. Crackling. It was as if someone was suffocating, trying to continue.
2 Army Corps.
Confirmed. Martinez exchanged glances with Graves when he heard the sound of heavy-caliber gunfire on the radio.
2 Army Corps have gone over to the side of the enemy.
Silence. It was as if someone had squeezed the heart of everyone who heard it. I repeat, the 17th and 23rd U.S. Army Corps are officially operating under the control of an extraterrestrial force. They're attacking people. They use our technology. They're conducting sweeps in the south. Nikolai felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Battles between the invading forces have been recorded. The third force... Caldwell exhaled heavily. Who hears? Who hears? I'm transmitting safe zones. In a private cipher. The key to the cipher. Static roared. The voice distorted, stretched into an otherworldly howl, as if someone was shouting on the other end of the connection. But this scream was turned inside out by radio waves. And everything. The session was interrupted. They just stood there, each clutching at their own thoughts, at the words they had just heard. 17th and 23rd Corps. Traitors? Hypnotized? Converted? What is the third force? And who is still alive? Nikolai met Graves's gaze. In the dim light of the streetlights, the American's eyes were hard and cold, but there was a shadow of doubt in them. Nikolai slowly retreated, feeling an icy prick of foreboding run down his spine. His back was against the exit wall from the platform, his hands still on his assault rifle.
Weapons ready for battle,
he commanded softly in Russian. Tsiganov and Tarasov understood him immediately. Their fingers tightened on the triggers. Martinez stood up abruptly and spat at his feet, frowning. Everyone heard, right? Russia launched a nuclear strike. The silence was as heavy as a concrete slab. Nikolai slowly raised his left hand, calling for calm, but his right hand remained on the trigger of the rifle.
What the fuck does that mean?
His voice sounded hollow, strangled, as if he were about to be stabbed.
That Russia is at war with the United States?
Graves opened his mouth, but didn't have time to utter a word. A shot rang out. A burst from a machine gun. Caldwell pulled the trigger first, and Nikolai, tumbling for cover, felt the screeching tracers tear the air. Tsiganov ducked behind a column, pressing his Pecheneg control panel into his shoulder, and turned the barrel around. The cue boiled the air, turning the station into a hellish meat grinder. The Americans screamed, falling one by one. Valeri fired short bursts, precisely, deliberately, cutting them off like dry grass. Graves fell to his knees, clutching at his throat where a bloody hole had opened. Martinez tried to crawl away, but Nikolai saw his eyes. He already knew that he would not get out. Nikolai wanted to shout, "Stand down!" But he didn't. He just stood there and watched as the massacre ended as quickly as it had begun. A minute later, he was alone. Tarasov lay dead on the steps leading up to the rotunda. Tsiganov moaned, clutching his side, blood flowing down his armor in viscous black streaks. Nikolai cursed, tore the pistol from his chest holster, approached each American, and finished off in turn with a shot to the head.
Bang!
Bang, bang, bang. The last one was Graves. He was still breathing, gasping for air, clutching his shot throat.
Nikolai looked at him, and he fired. Then he turned to Tsiganov.
Nikolai silently knelt down, pulling out an individual dressing bag from his waist bag. The blood had already soaked Tsiganov's armor, dark, sticky, and hot.
"Don't,
whispered Valeri. His voice was hoarse, fading like a fire burning down in ashes. "I'm fucked." Nikolai clenched his teeth and lowered his head. "Don't say that. Save your strength." Tsiganov grinned. A faint, barely noticeable grin, more like a grimace of pain. "Kolya, you know perfectly well that I'm going to die now." He coughed, and red foam broke out on his lips, but he still held on. Still didn't give up. "Listen. Mind me. The explosives are in Jack's pouch. Nikolai looked up sharply. They'll come for me. Tsiganov swallowed hard and looked into the darkness of the tunnel. Sooner or later, they always come. Let them blow up here. Let the passage collapse. I'll take at least 1 or 2 with me. He spoke confidently, but Nikolai saw his gaze fade. He straightened up and nodded. Finish you off? Tsiganov closed his eyes. Yes. Nikolai raised the pistol, aimed it clearly at the forehead. For a second, it seemed to him that the shadows had thickened around him, that the subway had stopped, was hiding, listening. The roar of a single shot echoed through the tunnel, echoing off the walls with an empty, dead echo. Nikolai worked quickly but carefully. With hands shaking with fatigue, he secured the charges, checked the detonators, dragged Tarasov's lifeless body to Tsiganov, and crossed them with his hand, closing his fingers on his chest. "Greetings from the Russian Special Forces, you alien bitches," he said, tightening the straps on their bodies as if preparing them for the last battle. He understood that he would not be able to carry all the Americans' weapons. Their rifles, unloads, and ammunition supplies were all too heavy, and equipment now meant more than supplies. So he slung his Scar H over his back, walked over to Caldwell's body, and grabbed his saw machine gun, habitually checked the bolt, and looked around. Pouches, ammunition. He pulled out the cartridge boxes, stuffed them into his backpack, and checked the tape. There was a walkie-talkie next to Martinez's corpse. He bent down, picked her up, brushed the blood splatters off her, turned the frequency control, adjusting the signal to receive. A voice came over the speaker of the walkie-talkie, harsh, broken by static, but still alive. Montana again. Montana, I'm transmitting on all frequencies. We've beaten off 4 attacks. We're holding on to the limit. Nikolai froze, pressing the speaker into his ear as if trying to break through the crackle and hum tearing the frequency. I'm telling everyone, the satellite system is used by aliens for detection. All observatories and satellite monitoring stations should stop broadcasting. They're using our satellites. Damn. Only short, wave and long-wave radio signals are allowed. Our people are restoring the relay system. The voice began to tear, to fade, as if someone was chopping up the radio waves with a blunt knife. And suddenly there was an explosion, booming, biting, so real that Nikolai involuntarily jerked, pressing himself into the concrete. The session ended. Static hissed, but something moved in that hiss. A new voice, calm, heavy, steeped in vile self-confidence. They finished off the bastards. Nikolai suddenly felt a rush of heat. The aliens will be pleased. He froze, not breathing. Their leader promised that after their final victory, we will become kings on the planet. Kings. The traitors. Montana was taken. Nikolai slowly removed the radio from his ear and licked his dry lips. 17th and 23rd Army Corps, dogs that have gone over to the creatures. They stormed Montana, and they won. He switched the radio to broadcast, pressed the button. His voice sounded cold and steady. Reception. Reception. Silence, and then a voice, this time dry and indifferent, like that of a dispatcher recording incoming data. The reception has been confirmed. Identify yourself. Are you from the Corps unit? Nikolai smiled. It's not good. It's dirty. Grinning. He took a deep breath, letting anger fill him from the inside like fire in a furnace. And he exhaled into the microphone. I'm from the Resistance. And remember, bitches. He paused, letting them drink their fill of anticipation. And then he said slowly, clearly, with absolute confidence, I'll kill you all. There was laughter in response, deaf, stringy, soaked in vile self-satisfaction. What kind of resistance? His voice was gruff, grinning like a drunken killer who didn't care about the consequences. You're half-finished rats. The guys and I decided to live out our lives in general chaos as people. We're going to kill you. Nikolai listened in silence. "I'll tell you to poke around a bit, asshole," the voice continued. "The old world is no more. Are you aware that a piece has broken off from South America?" Nikolai froze. "Australia has almost gone underwater. Glaciers are melting. Earthquakes. For a reason. Why do you think the aliens are messing with us and the planet is collapsing on its own?" "Oh, shit." They cracked the tectonic plates, created a slow rift. "In a couple of decades, there will be only rubble here." The radio crackled, and the voice became almost friendly. "But that's not the main thing, do you hear? The main thing is humanity. Billions of people, all this two-legged herd, they're practically all dead." Nikolai's back went cold. "Our new owners, oddly enough, feed on human flesh. Damn." "There's a famine on their home planet, shit with food and water. Clean water, you know? They rock the oceans. That's the joke, Rat. Are you listening? Listen. Oceans are rocking." Nikolai involuntarily clenched his fist. The world ocean. The main source of oxygen. Climate stabilizer. Water. They didn't just kill people. They were destroying the planet itself. "They'll take what they need and leave. And we'll stay." The radio crackled with static, but the voice cut through again with a hint of pleasure. "An organized, armed force. And such netobits like you will lick our heels, or they'll die." He laughed again. "Do you want some more? Are you listening?" Nikolai did not answer. "They came here in small numbers. This is not an invasion, you stupid bitch. This is a hunting expedition." Everything inside Nikolai turned cold. "You can't break them. Are you jerking off to your pathetic humanity, which has been killing itself for centuries, huh? You can't beat them." Nikolai was silent. "But you can try." The radio wheezed nastily. "Russia is still trying." Nikolai exhaled through his nose. The person who spoke into the radio did not know that he was Russian. Russia was still fighting. In Russia, someone made the decisions. Someone was in charge. Someone was struggling. And here, in a foreign land, he will remain. Guard Chief Nikolai Smirnov, Special Forces of the Airborne Forces, a fighter of his homeland, a fighter of humanity, and he would kill them all.